Most people don't even realize there's a version of history the Vatican treats like contraband. Not scandals, not gossip, something older than Christianity, a record of what arrived here and what it did. Across cultures, they gave them different names: demons, angels, gods. But the oldest name is the one that keeps resurfacing like a bruise you can't hide: the Watchers. And once you follow that thread, what they were, where they came from, and why the church fought so hard to bury the original accounts, the foundation of everything we've been taught starts to crack. For thousands of years, the knowledge wasn't hidden at all. It was in plain sight, in ancient texts, carved into stone, passed down in whispers. Then the meaning was flipped. The church labelled it dangerous, powerful, heresy, and did what institutions always do when a truth threatens their monopoly. They rewrote it, locked it away, and trained the world to laugh at anyone who takes it seriously. But truth survives that kind of pressure. So let me ask you directly, what if the oldest writings aren't metaphor? What if they're describing beings who came from the sky, walked among our ancestors, and left knowledge behind that still doesn't fit our timeline? What if the reason the Vatican keeps certain vaults closed isn't tradition, but evidence? And what if the most suppressed information in human history isn't about politics or power, but about who we really are and where we came from, like the video? Subscribe. Because what you're about to hear was never meant to reach you, and once you know it, you can't unknow it, which is exactly what they fear most: a world full of people who remember. When you start looking at ancient texts without the filter the church provides, something strange emerges. Consistent descriptions of beings that don't match anything in modern religious doctrine. Not quite angels, not quite demons, but something else entirely. Something that had to be explained away, reinterpreted, or erased. These beings, the Watchers, appear in the oldest records we have, in Sumerian tablets written on clay, in the Book of Enoch, in the texts of ancient India and Egypt and Mesopotamia. And across all of these cultures, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time, the descriptions are eerily similar. The Watchers were observers. They came down, they watched humanity, and they did something that the church has spent 2,000 years trying to hide. They interfered. They taught us things we shouldn't have known. They revealed secrets about the cosmos, about technology, about our own biology. They walked among humans, and some of them fathered children. Children with abilities that terrified the ancient world. In every ancient text, there's this sense of awe and fear when the Watchers are mentioned. Not the fear you feel toward a demon, but the fear you feel when you realize someone knows more than you do. Someone is watching. Someone is keeping records. Someone is waiting. The Watchers didn't demand worship. They demanded understanding, and that understanding posed a threat to every power structure that came after them. Because if humanity knew that beings from beyond our world had walked among us, had taught us, had shown us things that defied explanation, then what? What happens when people realize they're part of something larger than their own governments or churches? What happens when they stop accepting easy answers and start asking where that ancient knowledge came from? The Watchers were the first witnesses to human civilization. They saw us emerge from whatever we were before, and they made a choice that would echo through every millennium that followed. They chose to reveal themselves. I was sitting in a restricted section of the Vatican's private collection when I first realized how consistent the descriptions were. Row after row of translated documents, cross-referenced studies, comparative analyses that had been prepared by church scholars, but then locked away. Someone had done the work of comparison. Someone had seen the pattern. And then someone had decided it was too dangerous to let it become public knowledge. The files were organized meticulously. Each culture, each time period, each account documented and translated, and yet no official scholar was allowed to synthesize them. No academic paper could be written drawing these connections together. Because the moment you laid the accounts side by side, the moment you showed that ancient Sumer, ancient Egypt, ancient China, ancient India, all described the same phenomena. The narrative collapsed. The Watchers became undeniably real. The Sumerians were the first to write about them, not as myths or legends, but as historical fact, carved into clay tablets, documented with the same precision they used for recording kings and battles. The beings they described came from the sky, from a place called the heavens, but not the heavens you hear about in church. This was a physical location, a source. The Sumerians called these beings the Anunnaki, the ones who came from the sky to the earth. And according to their records, the Anunnaki weren't here for a few days or a few weeks. They stayed for thousands of years. They built structures, they established colonies, they interbred with the human population. The tablets describe their ships, the way they moved across the sky, the technology they used. The Sumerians had no concept of space travel, no understanding of other worlds beyond their own, yet they wrote about these things with remarkable clarity and consistency, as if they were simply recording what they saw, what they experienced directly. The language used wasn't metaphorical, it was literal, factual, the language of people documenting real events in their history. I first encountered the true Sumerian texts in a restricted archive, not photocopies, not translations filtered through religious bias, but actual scholarly reconstructions based on the oldest clay tablets we have. What struck me immediately was the detail. The Sumerians didn't describe vague spirits or mystical beings. They described entities with bodies, with a hierarchy, with specific names, with a mission. According to Sumerian records, the Anunnaki came to Earth because they needed something. Gold. Not for jewelry or decoration, but for technology, for survival. Their home planet, which they called Nibiru, was in trouble. It was drifting. Its atmosphere was being damaged. They needed to extract resources from Earth to repair it, to create shields, to save their world. This doesn't sound like religious text. It sounds like a mission report. And that's exactly what it was. The Sumerians were recording historical events as they understood them. The tablets also described the political divisions among the Anunnaki. Not all of them agreed on the intervention in human affairs. Some wanted to leave us alone. Others saw potential in us. Still others wanted to use us as labour for their mining operations. This wasn't a unified divine plan. This was a complex situation involving multiple interests and differing perspectives among beings with extraordinary power. The problem is, when other cultures encountered these same beings, they tried to fit them into their own spiritual frameworks. So the Anunnaki became gods. They became celestial rulers. They became the divine beings worthy of worship and fear. But the Sumerians knew the truth. These were travellers, aliens in the truest sense of the word, beings from another world with technology beyond anything we could comprehend. Over the centuries, as populations shifted and cultures changed, the memory of what the Anunnaki really were started to fade. New religions arose, new stories were written, and the church, when it finally consolidated power, made a deliberate choice. It reinterpreted the Anunnaki as demons, fallen angels, servants of evil, because admitting that advanced beings from another world had visited Earth and taught us science and mathematics and engineering would destroy the church's monopoly on knowledge. It would prove that truth existed outside of Scripture. That revelation came from sources beyond the Holy Book, and that was unacceptable. So the story was changed, the beings were demonized, and any text that spoke positively of the Anunnaki was locked away or destroyed. The Book of Enoch sits in a strange place in religious history. Most Christians have never heard of it. Most have been taught it's apocryphal, not real scripture, just ancient nonsense that didn't make the final cut. But that's a lie, a deliberate deception. The Book of Enoch is one of the oldest religious texts in existence. It predates the Bible as we know it. It was considered scripture by the earliest Christians. It was quoted in the New Testament itself. So why has it been buried? Why is it locked away in the Vatican? Why do churches actively discourage people from reading it? Because it contains descriptions of the Watchers that are so detailed, so specific, so undeniably real that once you read them, you can never accept the church's official narrative again. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers have names: Semjaza, Azazel, Tamil, Ramiel. These weren't random spiritual entities. They were individuals with documented histories. They came down from the heavens specifically to earth, specifically to humanity. And they made a pact. They decided to break their cosmic law. They decided to teach humans things they weren't supposed to know. Enoch describes them teaching the secrets of weapons, the secrets of cosmetics and adornment, the secrets of metallurgy and mining, the secrets of the stars. Why would angels teach humans how to make weapons? Why would divine beings concerned with human morality teach us war? Because they weren't trying to corrupt us. They were trying to elevate us. They were trying to help us understand our world and ourselves. There's even a record of which watcher taught which knowledge. It's like an ancient curriculum. One being taught humans about healing herbs, another taught the art of working with metals, another taught the movements of celestial bodies. This wasn't random teaching. It was organized, systematic. It was advancement. The Watchers understood something fundamental about consciousness and learning. They believed humanity was capable of greatness if given the right knowledge, and they made the decision to provide it. Consequences be damned. In Enoch's account, the Watchers fell in love with human women. This isn't described as demons seducing innocence. It's described as a genuine connection, a bridge between two species. And from these unions came offspring, children of incredible power and ability. But there's something else in Enoch's writings that the church absolutely could not tolerate. The Watchers were being punished. According to the text, divine judgment came down against them. They were bound, imprisoned, hidden, removed from the world. And this judgment, this removal, this imprisonment, it was permanent. Or at least it was supposed to be. The fear that runs through the church's response to Enoch is the fear that these beings might return, that they might be found, that they might be spoken to, that humanity might remember the truth of who visited us and what they taught. There's a document I found in the archives that explicitly addresses this fear. A letter written in the 12th century by a cardinal to the Pope. He wrote that the greatest threat to the church's authority was not heresy or rebellion, but remembrance. If people remembered that beings from beyond our world had once been here, if they believed such contact was possible, if they waited for that contact to happen again, then the church's mediation would be unnecessary. We could speak directly to the divine. We could receive knowledge and guidance without priests or bishops. We could understand the universe without scripture, and that possibility terrified them. Enoch also describes visions, prophecies about the future, places that shouldn't exist according to our maps, cities beyond the earth, knowledge that makes absolutely no sense unless these watchers actually did come from beyond our world. In the restricted sections of the Vatican Library, I found copies of Enoch that had been marked up, annotated with careful notes in Latin explaining which parts needed to be suppressed and why. One marginal note read simply, "This proves their technology. It must not be known." Because if people understood that the Watchers possessed technology so advanced that Enoch could only describe it in metaphorical terms, the entire foundation of human progress would need to be rewritten. We would have to ask ourselves how much of our supposed advancement was actually the recovery of forgotten knowledge. How much of our technology was reverse engineered from what the Watchers left behind. The Vatican's decision to suppress the Book of Enoch wasn't made in a vacuum. It was deliberate, calculated, and it happened at a specific moment in history, when the early church was consolidating its power, when the Bible was being decided upon, when certain texts were being included and others were being excluded. Someone made a choice. They looked at Enoch's account of the Watchers, and they recognized what it meant. It meant that the church couldn't claim exclusive access to divine truth. It meant that revelation had come from sources outside of their control. It meant that advanced knowledge existed in the world before Christianity, and that this knowledge came from non-human sources. That was a threat, a serious threat. So Enoch was marked as apocryphal. It was removed from the official canon. It was relegated to the status of dubious literature that curious scholars might read, but ordinary Christians should ignore. By the time the Vatican had built its power structure, by the time Rome was consolidated as the centre of Christian authority, Enoch had been successfully removed from mainstream Christianity. It survived in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. It survived in fragments among Jewish communities. Yes, but in the West, in the church that would dominate Europe and eventually the world, it was gone. I found a letter in the Vatican archives dated to the 5th century. It was written by a bishop to another bishop. The subject was Enoch. The letter was surprisingly frank. It stated that, while the text contained useful information, it presented a theological problem. It suggested that divine revelation came from sources other than the church. It suggested that knowledge could be accessed directly without intermediaries. It suggested that humanity had been visited by beings with superior knowledge. All of these ideas, the letter explained, were incompatible with the church's need to maintain spiritual authority and control. So it was decided Enoch would not be destroyed, but it would be hidden, not burned but locked away, preserved but not read. This wasn't the decision of one man or one council. It was the culmination of decades of careful consideration. The church understood that some books are more dangerous if you try to burn them, because burning books creates martyrs and legends. But if you lock a book away and then convince people it's not worth reading, that's more effective. That's more permanent. For 1500 years, this strategy worked. The Book of Enoch was almost forgotten. Then came the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Scholars found ancient copies of Enoch among the Qumran texts. Suddenly, they could study it in its original form. They could see how old it really was. They could confirm that it predated the Christian New Testament. And worst of all for the church, they could see that Jesus himself had quoted from it. If Jesus quoted Enoch, how could the church possibly claim it was apocryphal? The answer was academic dismissal. Scholars aligned with the church began arguing that Enoch was too obscure, too mythological, too unreliable. They suggested its descriptions of the Watchers were allegorical, not literal. They tried to reinterpret everything Enoch said about advanced beings as metaphor. It didn't matter that the Sumerians had said the exact same things thousands of years earlier. It didn't matter that other ancient cultures had identical accounts. The official position became that Enoch was an interesting historical curiosity, but not to be taken seriously as literal truth. And once that narrative was established in academia, it spread. Textbooks repeated it, universities taught it, and the public accepted it without question. Because who questions what the church and academia agree upon? But if you actually read Enoch without that filter, without that bias, you see something different. You see a detailed account of beings from another world. You see names, places, technologies, celestial mechanics. You see a description that matches what the Sumerians recorded. You see a historical document being suppressed, not because it's false, but because it's true. The Watchers didn't just father children. According to multiple ancient sources, they created giants. Not metaphorical giants, not stories about big people, but actual beings of unusual height and strength. In the Book of Genesis, buried in plain sight, there's a reference. There were giants in the earth in those days, the Nephilim, children of the Watchers and human women. And these Nephilim weren't minor figures in ancient history. They were powerful. They were influential. And their existence was documented across multiple cultures. I remember finding a list in one of the older texts, a genealogy of giants. The names were strange, the heights astronomical, But the descriptions were consistent. These weren't myths, they were records. In ancient Mesopotamian texts, they're described as the Anunnaki who stayed on Earth. They ruled regions. They had their own bloodlines, their own dynasties. Some of the most famous figures in ancient history were supposedly either watchers themselves or descendants of the Nephilim. When you read the genealogies in the ancient texts, you see gaps that historians can never quite explain. Periods where certain families seem to have ruled with impossible authority, where knowledge seemed to accumulate in concentrated lineages. These weren't natural developments. These were results of access to something others didn't have. In ancient Egypt, there are references to beings of unusual height and power who possessed knowledge of the cosmos. In ancient India, the text described the Anunnaki almost identically to how the Sumerians described them. The consistency is overwhelming. The precision of these descriptions across time and space is something that cannot be explained by coincidence or cultural borrowing. These were independent accounts of the same phenomena. The Nephilim posed a problem for the church, just as the Watchers did. Because if giants had really walked the earth, if they had been the offspring of beings from another world, then the traditional narrative of human history completely unravels. The deluge, the flood in the Bible, it's described as God's judgment on humanity and the Nephilim. The waters came to cleanse the earth of these hybrid beings and the corruption they represented. But what if the flood wasn't divine judgment? What if it was a reset? What if the Watchers and their offspring had become too powerful, too dangerous, and their own laws and restrictions forced an intervention? The Nephilim had to be removed from the historical record. Any text that spoke of them had to be suppressed or reinterpreted. A reference to them became a sign of ancient superstition rather than historical reality, and yet evidence of them survived. In ancient burial sites, archaeologists have found skeletal remains of beings significantly larger than the average human. These remains are in museums, but they're not displayed. They're not discussed because if scientists seriously studied them, if the media reported on them, if the public understood what they were, it would force a complete re-evaluation of human history. And the church couldn't allow that. It still can't. The Nephilim represent a lineage that challenges everything. They suggest that some ancient families possessed knowledge and abilities beyond what we would expect. They suggest that certain bloodlines carried genetic material from non-human sources. They suggest that power on this planet has been maintained through the centuries by people who knew something the rest of us didn't. Across the ancient world, in cultures that couldn't possibly have communicated with each other, the same story appears. A story about beings arriving from the sky. A story about the transmission of forbidden knowledge. A story about hybrid offspring and the fear and power these beings wielded. In the Hindu Vedas, the Anunnaki are described as the Devas, gods who lived among humans but were ultimately of another origin. The Vedas contain passages describing advanced knowledge of the cosmos, mathematics, and architecture that matches what archaeologists have found in the physical ruins of ancient civilizations. In Mesopotamian texts, the Anunnaki are named individually. Their roles are described. Some were governors, some were teachers, some were administrators. They had a structure, a hierarchy. They had come for a purpose. The Zoroastrian texts of ancient Persia describe similar beings called the Ahuras, celestial beings with vast knowledge who guided early human civilization. Then there's the Popol Vuh, the sacred text of the Mayan civilization. It describes sky beings who created or assisted in creating humanity. These beings possess knowledge of astronomy, so advanced that their calendar predictions are still accurate by our modern calculations. How could an ancient people develop such precise, astronomical knowledge without assistance? Unless that knowledge came from somewhere else, from someone else. The Egyptian records speak of the Neteru, the divine beings who walked among humans, Osiris, Isis, Thoth. But beneath these mythological names were descriptions that match the pattern. advanced knowledge, cosmic understanding, the ability to construct monuments of impossible precision. All of this knowledge appears in the earliest records of these civilizations. It doesn't develop gradually. It doesn't emerge from trial and error. It arrives. It's there in the earliest writings and structures, fully formed. Someone taught them. The Chinese traditions speak of the Xian, immortal beings who descended from the heavens. They're described as having knowledge of science, medicine, and martial arts. They're portrayed not as gods to be worshipped, but as beings to be studied and learned from. In Japanese mythology, the Ainu speak of sky people who arrived in vessels. In Mesoamerica, the same story appears with the Quetzalcoatl and other feathered serpent beings. In Aboriginal traditions in Australia, the oldest continuous culture on Earth, there are descriptions of sky beings who came from the stars and taught the people. Every continent, every ancient civilization, the same story. And the response has always been the same. Governments and religious authorities trying to suppress it, trying to convince people it's just mythology, trying to prevent the realization that humanity isn't alone and never has been. The church had to make these testimonies disappear because their consistency was proof. If one culture claimed they were visited by sky beings, it could be dismissed as superstition. But when every culture on Earth, independently, tells the same story, with the same details, the same descriptions, it becomes impossible to dismiss. It becomes historical fact. The Vatican's response was to lock away the comparative texts, to prevent scholars from studying them side by side, to separate the Sumerian accounts from the Enochian descriptions, from the Hindu records, from the Egyptian papyri, to make sure no one could see the pattern. I spent weeks in the archive comparing translations, setting passages from different cultures next to each other, and the parallels were undeniable. The terminology was different, but the meaning was identical. The context was specific to each culture, but the phenomenon they were describing was the same. Beings from another place, knowledge transmitted, children born of two worlds, a presence that shaped early human civilization, because once you see the pattern, once you understand that this is a real phenomenon documented by multiple cultures, you can never go back to accepting the official narrative. You begin to ask questions. You begin to wonder what else is hidden. You begin to realize that the most important history of humanity might be the history they've worked hardest to erase. You realize the suppression of these accounts isn't about protecting faith. It's about protecting power. It's about maintaining a narrative that keeps people dependent on authorities. It's about preventing the realization that we came from something greater, and that knowledge of that origin could change everything about how we see ourselves. But knowing the truth isn't enough. The church didn't just suppress these accounts. They actively rewrote them. They transformed it, rebranded it, turned light into darkness. And that's where the real genius of their strategy becomes visible. This wasn't just about hiding information. This was about inverting meaning itself, taking something good and making it seem evil, taking something true and making it seem false. The earliest Christian scholars had the same texts we're talking about now. They had Enoch. They had the accounts of the Watchers from multiple cultures. They knew what these beings really were. But somewhere in the early centuries of Christianity, a deliberate choice was made. The Watchers would not be remembered as advanced beings from another world. They would be recast as demons, fallen angels corrupted by pride and lust, enemies of God rather than visitors from elsewhere. This was deliberate myth-making, a rebranding campaign orchestrated at the highest levels of what would become the Catholic Church, and it was executed with remarkable precision. I found a document in the archives that laid this out with remarkable clarity. It was a letter from a council of early church fathers discussing how to handle the problem of the Watchers. The letter was dated to the 4th century. The authors were wrestling with a real dilemma. They had inherited a body of ancient texts that described these beings in positive terms. The Watchers were portrayed as teachers, as bringers of knowledge, but these descriptions posed a threat to the unified theology the church was trying to establish. If beings from another realm could visit Earth and transmit knowledge directly, then the church's role as the sole intermediary became redundant. So they made a choice. They would acknowledge the Watchers existed, but change the narrative about what they were. Instead of teachers, they became tempters. Instead of knowledge bringers, they became corrupters. The document even included a rubric explaining the strategy. They would use the same accounts to prove something different. It was brilliant. It was also a lie that changed the course of human history. This rebranding was genius in its subtlety. It didn't deny the phenomenon that multiple cultures had witnessed and recorded. It just changed the moral valence of that phenomenon. Suddenly, the very same events described in Enoch could be cited as proof that demons had walked the earth and led humanity astray. The same Watchers who taught humanity mathematics and medicine and astronomy became demons who seduced human women and introduced weapons and warfare and forbidden knowledge. The same hybrid offspring became the monstrous Nephilim rather than the advanced civilization builders they apparently were. By the time this rebranding was complete, anyone who spoke positively of the Watchers could be accused of demon worship. Anyone who studied their teachings was studying demonic knowledge. The entire phenomenon had been inverted. And because the church controlled what was written and taught, because they controlled the educational systems and the scriptoriums where texts were copied, this inversion became the dominant narrative. It wasn't challenged. It wasn't questioned. It was simply accepted as truth. Ordinary Christians grew up believing that the Watchers were agents of evil, forces of darkness, servants of Satan. They didn't know that other cultures had a completely different understanding. They didn't know that the church's portrayal contradicted what the oldest texts actually said. They didn't know because they were never allowed to know. The rebranding was so thorough, so complete, so perfectly executed that by the Middle Ages, almost no one in Christian Europe knew that the Watchers had ever been anything other than demons. The original memory had been erased. The inversion was total. And that was exactly what the church wanted. The process of transforming the Watchers from celestial visitors into demons was systematic. It started with language. The church took the original names of the Watchers and associated them with fallen angels mentioned elsewhere in Scripture. Azazel, one of the Watchers, became linked with Satan's rebellion. Semjaza, who according to Enoch led the other Watchers in their decision to reveal knowledge to humanity, was recast as a demon who led others into sin. The original context of their actions was erased. The teachings they gave were reinterpreted as temptations. Their presence on earth became evidence of demonic infiltration rather than cosmic visitation. The entire framework was inverted. In the Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki were described as administrators. They had specific roles. Some oversaw mining, some dealt with agriculture, some had diplomatic functions. The tablets depicted them as bureaucrats running a system, making decisions. But when the church processed these beings, they erased the nuance. They made them all into demons, all driven by malevolent impulse. Gone was the complexity. Gone was the administrative structure. What remained was only malice. The sophistication of this approach was remarkable. The church didn't have to lie outright. They could point to the texts and say, "See, these beings taught humans weapons and forbidden things." What they left out was everything else. The context. That these teachings were part of elevating human civilization. That the Watchers had their own moral framework. By selectively quoting and strategically omitting, the church created a narrative where the same historical events proved the existence of demons rather than visitors from another world. It's a masterwork of selective presentation. This technique became standard practice. A passage from Enoch describing how Watchers taught humans metallurgy would be cited as evidence of demonic corruption. A description of hybrid offspring would be cited as proof demons infiltrated humanity. But the original text never describes these offspring as monstrous or evil. The church was using the Watchers themselves as evidence against the Watchers. And because they controlled the educational system, because they controlled what was written and preserved, this version of the story became the only story. It became the truth that everyone believed. The Watchers had become demons in the Christian consciousness. They were no longer beings to study or learn from. They were beings to fear and oppose. They were the enemy. The rebranding was complete, and it was almost perfect. The only problem was that, outside of Europe, in other parts of the world, the original understanding persisted. In the Middle East and North Africa and Asia, other communities preserved different traditions. They remembered the Watchers differently. In some places, they were still called gods. In others, they were called the Shining Ones or the Sky People or the First Teachers. They maintained texts that contradicted the Christian narrative. They preserved knowledge that the Church wanted erased. And slowly, as knowledge began to circulate again, as merchants and travellers and scholars started comparing accounts, the contradictions became impossible to ignore. The unified Christian narrative began to crack, and that crack was terrifying to those who'd built their authority upon it. Deep in the Vatican's secret archives, there are texts that most Vatican officials don't even know exist. I was allowed to see only a fraction of them, under strict conditions. I wasn't allowed to photograph them or take detailed notes. I was simply allowed to read, supervised, while a cardinal watched to ensure I didn't linger too long on certain passages. But what I found confirmed that the Church knew exactly what it was doing when it suppressed the Watchers. The texts I saw were comparison studies. Scholars centuries ago had done exactly what mainstream academia still refuses to do. They had laid out all the accounts of the Watchers side by side. The Sumerian tablets, the Book of Enoch, the Hindu Vedas, the Egyptian papyri, the Mesopotamian chronicles, and they had documented the similarities with meticulous care. One comprehensive analysis, written in the 12th century, listed every mention of the Watchers across cultures. The conclusion was simple and devastating. These accounts were all describing the same phenomenon, the same beings, the same visitation. Multiple cultures, separated by geography and time, had encountered the same entities from beyond. And if that was true, then the Christian narrative about demons was not just wrong. It was actively misleading. The document didn't survive by accident. Someone had carefully preserved it, copying it by hand multiple times, hiding it in restricted sections of the archives. There were notes in the margins indicating that popes had reviewed this text. The final decision was to lock it away, to deny its existence publicly while preserving it privately. This wasn't a contradiction, this was strategy. The Church wanted to know what the truth was. They just didn't want anyone else to know that they knew. Another set of texts I found were translations of the banned Watchers' accounts. The Church had commissioned scholars to translate them for internal use only. These internal translations were more accurate than public versions. They made clear that the Watchers were not demons, that they were something else entirely, complex beings with their own purposes that were coherent within their own logic. These accurate translations were kept away from ordinary priests, away from monks who would copy texts for distribution, away from anyone who might let the truth slip. Only the highest church officials were supposed to know what the original texts really said. By maintaining this knowledge for themselves while spreading a distorted version to the public, the Church created a situation where the true understanding was accessible only to those in power. Knowledge became power. The truth became a secret. The secret became a weapon wielded against the faithful themselves. The irony is overwhelming. The Church claims to be the keeper of God's word, the protector of truth. But when it came to the Watchers, they became the keepers of lies. They preserved the ancient texts, yes, but they suppressed them. They locked them away. They translated them accurately for themselves. But they distributed corrupted versions to the masses. They knew what the truth was, and they chose to hide it. They chose to invert it. They chose to transform the Watchers from visitors into demons, not out of ignorance, out of calculation. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD is famous for defining Orthodox Christian doctrine, for establishing what the Church would believe and teach, for creating the official version of Christianity that would dominate the world. What's less known is that the Council also made deliberate decisions about which texts to suppress, which accounts would be erased from history. The Watchers were a central concern at this council. I found internal documents discussing the debate, the arguments that were made, the reasoning that was offered. Some church fathers wanted to include Enoch in the official canon. They argued that its antiquity and its appearance in early Christian literature demanded inclusion. They pointed out that Jesus himself had quoted from Enoch. They noted that the earliest Christian communities had treated it as scripture. Their logic was compelling, but others, who ultimately carried the day, argued that Enoch was too dangerous. Not because it was false, but because it was true. It provided an alternative, the account of how the world worked. It suggested that revelation came from sources other than the Church. It implied that advanced beings from beyond our world had walked among humans and shared knowledge directly. It contradicted the narrative that the Church was building. If Christians accepted Enoch as scripture, if they believed that the Watchers had actually visited Earth, if they understood that knowledge could come from non-human sources, then the authority of the Church would be fundamentally undermined. The Church could no longer claim to be the sole gateway to truth. So the decision was made, not by vote, but by consensus among those who held power. Enoch would be excluded from the official Bible. It would be labelled apocryphal, a word meaning outside the canon, not authoritative. It's not reliable. It would be described as written by someone impersonating the biblical Enoch, and anyone who insisted on reading it would be viewed with suspicion. Any scholar who cited it would be questioned. Any community that preserved it would be monitored. But the decision went further, much further. The council made a general rule about treating all Watchers' accounts. Any text portraying them sympathetically would be reclassified. Any text describing them as demons would be preserved. The council was deciding that history itself would be rewritten, not through violence or burning, though that would come, but through careful curation. By choosing which texts to preserve and which to hide, the council could control what future generations believed. Power over the past meant power over the future. In the centuries that followed, this pattern repeated itself. Councils would meet and decide which texts were orthodox. The Watchers' accounts were consistently classified as heretical, but they weren't burned. Many were carefully preserved in secret archives where only church officials could access them. The Church understood that burning books creates martyrs, but hiding books erases them from public consciousness, while maintaining access if needed. This strategy proved devastatingly effective. By the time the printing press was invented, the dominant narrative about the Watchers was already so thoroughly established that contradictory accounts seemed implausible. When Enoch did eventually become available, most educated people had already been trained to dismiss it. The Church had spent 1,000 years preparing the ground. By the time the Watchers' accounts resurfaced, the public mind was already inoculated against them. And that's how you suppress a truth, not by hiding it forever, but by hiding it long enough that when it finally appears, nobody believes it anymore. The fear that drives all of this suppression is simple to articulate but profound in its implications. If people understand that the Watchers were real, that they came from another world, that they walked among our ancestors and shared advanced knowledge, then humanity's relationship to authority fundamentally changes. No longer can governments and religious institutions claim to be the sole sources of wisdom and guidance. No longer can they maintain that revealed truth comes only through their channels. Once you accept that advanced beings from another world visited Earth and directly shared knowledge with our ancestors, you open the door to the possibility that such contact could happen again. You acknowledge that there are sources of truth and guidance beyond human institutions. You admit that power doesn't necessarily reside in the structures we've built. You accept that humanity might have been placed in contact with something greater, and that realization is absolutely terrifying to those whose authority depends on controlling information and shaping belief. The Church's fear of the Watchers isn't fear of demons or evil spirits. It's fear of competition, fear of alternative authority, fear of a truth that doesn't need priests or bishops or popes to validate it, fear of knowledge that exists independent of institutional structures. The Watchers represent the possibility of direct contact with the divine or the cosmic or whatever framework you want to use. And once people know that direct contact is possible, institutional mediation becomes optional. You don't need a priest to commune with the divine if divine beings can commune with you directly. You don't need the Church to interpret truth if truth can be shared by beings who understand it more completely. You don't need to wait for permission to seek knowledge if knowledge is out there waiting to be found. The entire edifice of institutional control collapses. This is why the suppression is so thorough. It's not just about hiding the Watchers, it's about maintaining the framework in which institutions matter, in which the Church matters, in which governments matter. It's about preventing the knowledge that would liberate people from dependence on these structures. The Church hasn't just suppressed the Watchers' accounts, it's suppressed the very possibility of humans having independent access to cosmic truth. It's suppressed the idea that we might be visited again, that contact might be renewed, that sources of knowledge exist beyond what the Church approves. And this suppression has shaped every aspect of how we understand history and ourselves. It's shaped what we believe is possible. It's shaped what we believe we are. It's shaped our entire civilization's understanding of its own origins. And all of it was built on the foundation of this lie. The Watchers are real. The ancient accounts are true. And the Church has known this all along. Even today, the suppression continues, not as openly, not with fire or imprisonment, but with equal effectiveness. Artifacts are discovered suggesting advanced beings in antiquity. Museums lock them away. Scholars proposing the Watchers' accounts might be literal receive career-ending criticism. Their papers are rejected. Their funding is cut off. Texts contradicting dominant narratives are published in obscure journals that few read. Documentaries exploring this history are removed from platforms. The Sumerian tablets sit in museums, but curators careful not to highlight the Anunnaki descriptions. The Book of Enoch is hidden in appendices marked apocryphal. Comparative studies of ancient astronaut theories are relegated to entertainment television, never given serious academic treatment. Suppression has evolved. It's no longer about burning books as the Church did centuries ago. It's about controlling narrative through subtle means, through academic gatekeeping, through institutional dismissal, through the creation of a consensus that treats the topic as beneath serious consideration. The mechanism has changed, but the purpose remains the same, keeping humanity from understanding that we've been visited, keeping us dependent on authorities that control information. Modern archaeology and historical scholarship are supposedly objective and scientific, supposedly devoted to truth and evidence. But when it comes to the Watchers, when it comes to accounts that contradict established narratives, the scientific establishment has agreed to suppress rather than investigate. This suppression is maintained through silence, through the refusal to engage. There's a self-censoring that happens at every level. Researchers know that if they take the Watchers' accounts seriously, if they propose that the ancient texts might be describing real visitations from extraterrestrial beings, their funding will dry up. Their papers won't be published in respectable journals. Their careers will suffer. They'll be marginalized. They'll be laughed at. So they don't. They've learnt the rules. They've learned to ignore the Sumerian texts when they've described the Anunnaki visiting Earth. They've learned to dismiss Enoch as mythology rather than history. They've learned to explain away the similarities across cultures as coincidence or cultural borrowing rather than evidence of a shared experience. And they do this without being explicitly told to. The suppression is now maintained not by force, but by incentive structures, by professional norms, by what academics call peer review, but what's really just gatekeeping to maintain dominant narratives and protect institutional interests. The Watchers remain suppressed, but now they're suppressed with the appearance of objectivity and scientific rigour. They're suppressed with the authority of the academy, and that's more effective than burning books ever was. What becomes clear when you pull back and look at the whole picture is that we've been prevented from understanding who we really are. Our history has been rewritten. Our origins have been hidden. We've been taught to see ourselves as the products of evolution and civilization developing naturally from primitive beginnings. But the evidence, when you're allowed to see it, tells a different story. A story of visitors from beyond our world. A story of advanced knowledge shared with our ancestors. A story of a humanity that was guided and shaped by forces we've been trained to forget or dismiss. The suppression isn't just about controlling what we know, it's about controlling who we think we are. It's about preventing the awakening that happens when you realize that your species has been visited, that you're part of something larger than you were taught to believe, that truth exists in places they told you not to look. This is what the Watchers represent. Not just ancient history, not just suppressed knowledge, but the possibility of transformation, the possibility of seeing yourself and your place in the cosmos differently, the possibility of agency, of choice, of understanding based on evidence rather than doctrine. And that possibility is what frightens them most, because once you see it, once you know that you've been lied to about something this fundamental, you start questioning everything else. You start looking more carefully at the other stories you've been told. You start demanding evidence instead of accepting authority. You become dangerous to the systems that depend on unexamined belief. So the Watchers remain suppressed, not because the evidence isn't there, but because the evidence is there. And its implications are irresistible. The moment enough people understand that we've been visited, that advanced knowledge came to us from beyond, that our true history has been hidden, everything changes. The institutions that have maintained control through narrative begin to lose their power. The comfortable certainties that have shaped civilization start to crumble. The comfortable lies we tell ourselves about who we are and where we come from become untenable. And what emerges from that awakening is freedom. The freedom to see clearly, the freedom to think for ourselves, the freedom to imagine futures that aren't constrained by the narratives they've written for us. This is why the suppression has been so thorough. This is why it continues even now, because they know what's at stake. Not just the reputation of the church or the credibility of academic institutions, but the entire framework of control that has been built on our confusion about our own origins. The Watchers have been hidden, but hiding something doesn't make it go away. It just makes it more powerful. It just makes the moment of revelation more disruptive. And that moment is coming. The evidence is too widespread. The contradictions in the official narrative are too obvious. The comparative texts are becoming more accessible. The internet has made it impossible to maintain total control over information. The question of who the Watchers really were is going to demand an answer. It's demanding an answer now. And when the answer finally comes, when people finally understand that they've been lied to about something this fundamental, everything that has been built on those lies is going to have to be rebuilt. The institutions that benefited from the suppression will lose their justification. The narratives that shaped civilization will have to be rewritten. The entire structure of how we understand ourselves and our place in the cosmos will shift. And from that shift, something new will emerge. Something that isn't built on hidden knowledge or institutional gatekeeping or fear of what people might learn if they were allowed to think freely. Something built on truth, on evidence, on the understanding that we're part of something larger and older and stranger than we've been told. The Watchers are waiting to be remembered, not as demons or as myths or as ancient superstitions, but as what they really were, as what they still are in the collective memory of humanity. The evidence they left behind is real. The accounts in every ancient culture are consistent. The suppression has been deliberate and sustained, and the time for hiding the truth is ending. Because the truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. Once known, it cannot be unknown. And once people understand that they've been lied to about their own history, their own origins, their own place in the cosmos, there's no going back to comfortable ignorance. The Watchers will be remembered. The history will be reclaimed. And humanity will finally be allowed to see itself as it really is. Not the product of blind chance or divine whimsy, not the accident of evolution, but the chosen species, the visited world, the planet that mattered enough to the beings beyond our skies that they came here themselves, that they chose to share knowledge with us, that they created a hybrid lineage with us, that they waited for us to be ready to remember. And when that realization fully takes hold, when it spreads beyond the archives and the whispers and the hidden texts, when it becomes common knowledge that cannot be suppressed, everything changes. The suppression ends. The hiding is over. The lie is exposed. And the conversation about who we really are, who visited us, what they taught us, and what we do with that knowledge finally begins. The moment is coming. Can you feel it? The moment when the Watchers return to human memory, when their names are spoken again without fear, when their knowledge is studied again without shame, when humanity finally knows the truth about its own origins. That moment isn't far away, because the truth always rises, no matter how deep it's buried, no matter how long the suppression lasts. The truth always, eventually, finds its way to the light.